Hello, I'm Arne Keijzer, who, along with my colleague and fellow interviewer Neil Horner, represent the Weston Voices Oral History Project, an initiative sponsored by the Weston Historical Society. Bob, thank you and your wife Hope for inviting us into your house today. Tell us, when did you move to Weston and what made you decide to settle here? And what was the town like in those days?
We moved to Weston because I got a job at Sikorsky Aircraft in Stratford and at Bridgeport at that time. And looking around, we just happened to find a house in this town, which we liked. So we moved here in June of '53 and lived on Weston Road. It was a house that was just completed, and we even moved in before the closing
Really?
because the builder's wife took a cotton to Hope and said, and who was quite pregnant at that time, and said that lady's going to have a home to bring her baby to. So she talked her husband into allowing the law to be grossly violated, and we moved in before the lawyers were aghast at the thing. But we've never looked back since then. And when you another question is, what was the town like then? One of the most dramatic differences between it then and today is the fact that there were very few trees compared to today. The whole Connecticut has reforested. We don't realize how many of the trees here only came along in the last half century, because I have a photograph of this property here looking south, and you don't see a tree. That's looking towards Steep Hill Road and to the farmhouse across the road, and there is only, I think there's one tree, and any trees that there were at that time were usually along the wall line, where the farmer didn't cut it down. He left it for shade for the livestock or whatever. But we don't realize how New England had been deforested, and Weston among it, because they had to provide for farms, crops, and livestock and so forth.
Were there still operating farms at the time you moved here?
There were a couple. But it was rare. No, it had largely farming had disappeared, but the open farmlands were still apparent in many parts of town. And that's why this field, for example, and all of this property was just open field at the time we moved to town. Since then, we used to be able to see this house from the road over in Wilton as we came back from shopping on Route 7. There's a, just at the, I don't know the name of the road, but we could look across the valley here. You don't realize there is a valley here, and see our house sitting on the side of this hill here from, that was about 3 miles away, 4 miles away. That's how open it was then. And everything is closed in since. You can't see any kind of view here because all the trees down the hill here are grown up, and they're big 60 to 100-foot trees now.
You mentioned that when you came here, you were working for Sikorsky.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about how you were educated, and what was your profession, and how did you end up working for Sikorsky, and what did you do?
I went to Hackley, Cornell, and then I started out in Bristol Myers Engineering Department. After that, I did all kinds of work there. I also worked at Anaconda Wire and Cable as a summer help guy, and that was very educational to me. I learned so much doing that. I worked for a rigger, which moved very, very heavy equipment with nothing more than a crowbar and a bunch of heavy wall pipe. And I found out what you could do with just 2 men and a boy type of thing. And I ran a jackhammer one summer, breaking up a concrete floor because the company was getting ready for World War II and wanted to get their World War I plant ready for that. So that's the kind of background I had there. I did a lot of things that taught me so much, that have stayed, the benefit has stayed with me my whole life. And then I went to Sikorsky just because the job was offered. It was there, and I liked the idea of getting out of New York City. I had a job there that was not satisfactory to me. And so I was at Sikorsky for 35 years. And another difference is when I went to commuted to Sikorsky in the 50s, there was no traffic. It was very easy. There was no parking problem. And when I retired in '86, the Merritt Parkway was becoming a sort of a moving traffic jam with lots of cars all the time. So the car population in the country has increased tremendously with all the downsides that go with that. It was really very nice in the 50s to move around. And I, even in the 60s, had an Alfa Romeo 5-speed sports car because you could drive it around here and actually get into fifth gear once in a while. Today, you wouldn't have a chance.
When you moved into Weston, who were your neighbors? Not specifically by name, but what kind of people were they? Were they veterans, or were they farmers, or folks that have been here for some time? Can you describe the makeup?
Mostly they were locals. When we moved in, there was still a good body of local people here. They were not necessarily farmers. A lot of them worked for the town, were local tradesmen, people like that. While we were here is when the influx came of all the new marrieds, and they comprised most of our acquaintanceship during those years. They came in droves, and they are the ones who populated all these houses that were being built on the new roads that were being built in town, like Joanne Lane and Cardinal Lane and Greenlee and Ravenwood, Mountain View. All of those were new roads. And as the houses went up, the people appeared, and they were the ones who had children that went to the school, and that's what caused the great burgeoning of population in the school system. And it was they were a very vibrant new element in the town, and they are the ones who largely displaced the good old boy type of government that the town had when we moved in. When we moved in, it was very sleepy, complacent, and the one town official would hire another town official to, I don't know, plow the streets or something like that. It was casual. It wasn't necessarily corrupt, but it was very local. And again, it was sort of the good old boy system. And it had worked for years. But with the advent of the influx of new population, these people were much too critical and live wire and onto things to allow that to continue. And that's when things began to change.
And this was in the 50s, late
This
50s,
was-
early 60s?
Late 50s, early 60s. Because we changed from an appointed boards to elected boards in the election of 67. And that's when I ran for P&Z. Because I didn't think I would have a chance before then, because for some reason the power structure in the town didn't feel they could count on me to have a known viewpoint. So that was sort of a little dangerous to them. But I ran for office on P&Z, and I got elected. And so that would really change everything in the town when all the boards went to elected. We got a different mix.
And what was the focus of P&Z when you were elected? Were there some major issues that needed to be dealt with right away, or things were pretty well under control?
The major issue was maintaining 2-acre zoning, because the town wasn't nearly as densely packed as it is today. Today it's almost an academic question, because there's so few acres available anywhere. In those days, there was lots and lots of open land still remaining, and there were commercial and other forces that would love to have, and the people who owned the property would have loved to have been able to get away with, say, 1 acre, and increase the value of their land. So there was very strong attitude of the people who had moved into town to maintain the 2-acre zoning, including the newcomers, because they said, we've got that part of the character of the town is the 2-acre zoning, because that gives us the separation and the idea that we're not going to have somebody in our looking in our window from next door. I think that and the school population, the financing of that. The budgets, again, like today, the budgets were always contentious because they were always too high. They were unconscionably high, and taxes were always too high. They should be cut back. And yet, we still had the realities of life we had to deal with.
What was the budget in those days?
I can't remember. 40 million, 30 million, something like I don't remember. But I knew it is, even then, it was about 85% school. And today I think it's about that. It's still around 88% school.
And what commercial enterprises were still in town when that was taking place? Any of the toy factories or the wire mill in Georgetown, or what was existing at that time?
Well, the wire mill was running. That was a going operation. The center had just come into being because Peter Robinson built it in the dark of night, so to speak, because there was no zoning. And he put up the center, and the town was aghast, or the old timers were aghast. So the town instituted a lawsuit against him. They hastily passed zoning regs. The first ones were 1 acre. And they passed that. Then they took Peter to court. And fortunately, Peter won the case so that the center could stay there. Because the fact that the center is there was the most wonderful relief valve from further commercial development in the town that you can imagine. It was a godsend. We didn't know it at the time. We looked at it as a horror, but actually it was a godsend. Because if that center hadn't been there, we would have gotten, North Main, or the Midtown Garage that is up the road, that would have probably expanded with a little store here and a little store there. Weston Gardens down at the corner would have expanded. We would have had a strip zone of commercial, in my opinion, all the way up to Georgetown if that center had not been there first. And that brought a focus to everybody's attention. Never again, no more commercial in town.
Now, this was in 1952 when the center
That
opened,
was,
right?
yes. Yep.
And I think one of the contributions that Peter probably originated was that the store should be functional as opposed to, clothing stores or things like that.
He did a marvelous job. First of all, it looks nice. It's well light. You figure that he did architecture. They're nice looking brick buildings. The whole thing was done well. It was a class act from the beginning. And he did want it to be local. So all the stores in there have always been that way. Some have tried, like a dress shop. What was her name, honey? That
We had a clothing store.
Yeah, we had a clothing store. We had a few enterprises. We had a barber shop, and so on. We had a barber shop for quite a long time. And so that was the nature of it. And that was what kept it going and people patronizing it because it was needed. The reason people go there is because it's a necessity. And
Now you joined the Young Republicans, I understand. And how was the politics in the late 50s and 60s? Was it contentious? Was there a majority in town that ran the town from a political party standpoint? Give me a little insight on that.
when we moved here in town, it was a Republican town. There was an established Republican group. They were largely the old timers in town. Some were like Willard Fanton. Okay, Fantons had been in town for, 100 years or so. He was the first selectman, I believe, at the time. And the others that were in there, Herbie Gifford, and so on, that came along to serve as second selectman, because the second selectman usually took care of the roads. That was sort of given. And he in turn got his guys together to take care of the roads. So again, it was the spreading out of the duties of government through a rather, you could call it a patronage system, but it wasn't all that evil. And it seemed to work pretty well when we were a sleepy little town. But then when we began to get all this activity and new homes coming in and lots of need for school buses and all the rest, it took on a different character. And the the old timers began to be displaced. They didn't like it and they fought it, but the force was too great. The young Republicans were, in effect, the junior members of the Republican Party who had just moved in. All the people like myself who have moved in, were having families and so on, and we were full of energy and ideas. So we formed this group that held monthly meetings and had agendas, sort of like the League of Women Voters does. You come up with an agenda and you present it to the town. And it was very active. We met in the primary school there in the big room that had a kitchen and a stage. And we had our meetings there. We brought our potluck suppers to the event, and we had cocktail hour and all the rest of it. It was so simple and so inoffensive, and today it would be totally unacceptable. But in those days it worked fine. And we left the place spotless at the end of the day.
And this was already at Hurlbut
Yes.
Elementary School?
Yeah. I think it's the same building that the senior center's in now. I can't remember, but anyway, that's what we did. It was unheard of that you had a citizens group coming in. It's very much like the Kiwanis having, say, their breakfast in the school with all the appurtenances that go with it. So it worked fine, and we became a political force gradually. We brought some things to the attention of the town. And one thing, when I was president of the Young GOP, we offered the audience to Lowell Weicker, who at that time was not favored by the Republican Party at all. He was a maverick, he was an unknown quantity. And so we offered him a chance to speak. I think we offered the first platform for him to speak in Connecticut. And subsequently, we got hell for it because the senior party told us we had no business doing such a thing. And they were probably right from a political point of view. But I thought it was a great meeting. We packed the house, and that's how Lowell launched his campaign. But we were viewed with suspicion, because normally the president of Young GOP would become a member of the town committee, a Republican town committee, when he resigned, and anybody from the Republican town committee left, he would take the place. Well, I was president of the YGOP for 2 years, and I was never invited to be on the Republican town committee. Again, if you're outspoken, why, it's not necessarily a favorable attribute among some political forces. They prefer to have something more predictable. So I think that slowed me down a little. But the 67 change of the charter so that people were elected rather than appointed was the window I needed to get into the mainstream.
You were outspoken politically as well as outspoken in terms of the development of the town?
Well, Hope's listening to this. I guess on all subjects. Yeah.
But how did you
He was
get...
just very controversial all the time.
Well, I just have my own views.
Speaking of your own views, how did they develop in terms of the land use and the development of the town, planning and all of that?
Well, that sort of took care of itself. There's a certain logic to the idea of a suburban community. The die had largely been cast here because we were surrounded by adequate commercial services. There was no great imperative for us to have the same or replicate all of those things here. Also, the people here wanted a residential community, and I agreed with them, it made sense. Later, when we began to look at aspects of it, such as opening up the town to medical clinics and so on, when I was chairman, we held 2 public hearings. We gave that issue a very fair hearing because the first time around it was heard by the town, and some people said, well, we don't think they got the message correctly. So I said, okay, we'll have another public hearing. And we had 2 of them on that. The town spoke quite clearly there that they didn't want it because once you get that in here, I mean, what's a clinic? All of a sudden it becomes a pharmacy, it becomes this. And we could see that progressing into a uncontrollable use of land unrelated to residential. So we stuck by our guns and just said, no, you're going to have a doctor's office in the house. And that's what has been the case here in town ever since. There were attempts to have various types of commercial operation in dwellings. And we were pretty strict on that, mainly because of the uncontrollability of it once it starts. You have to be able to define the limits. If you can't define the limits, then as far as I'm concerned, there are no limits. So we stuck pretty much by it. And my philosophy was that when I read today's forum about the need to update the plan and all of these horrible things that are happening in town, and we're not with it, and we've got to get up to speed, I say, this is the same darn record that I heard back in the 70s. We came up with a plan. We published it, and it was there, the town plan. I think we issued it near the end of 70s. There was another one somewhere in the 80s. There was another one that was just before 2000. Now we're back to doing the same thing. But I don't really see any marked difference in the issues that are involved there. People say, oh, we need a bus system. You tell me where you can run a bus system in this town. Ask Gordon, who runs the senior citizen bus. There is no focal point anywhere. Either it's door to door everywhere in town, or you've got to set up focal points and maybe bus kiosks and so on. And even then, it will never satisfy the people. It won't be used in the sense that we visualize it in our minds. It won't come out that way in reality. So there are a number of things that are just inherent in the character of the town that precludes a lot of the institutional answers, such as public transportation.
Tell me, how did someone who had a job as an engineer get interested in land use and got you so actively involved? And as we understand it, you developed the first town plan. So give us a sense of that transition into your becoming such an active force in land use planning in town.
Well, I'm interested in just about everything. No, really, because everything is interesting. So that's to start with. I became interested in land use because I got on the Planning and Zoning Commission, and then I became chairman, and that forced me into a position of having to know what I was doing and making sure that the commission was on track and was addressing the issues, and that we were running a productive, responsive type of commissions. And you can't do that if you don't have your ear open. So I think it forced a openness and receptiveness on my part to all the ideas that relate to land use. I did a lot of reading on it. We had a number of people come and speak on the issue, and it's an interesting issue. It became my specialty, you might say, because of my being on the Planning and Zoning Commission. And it sort of trailed along after that when I was on ZBA. I was on it for, about 16 years after I left P&Z, before I went into the code enforcement. I was on the building committee for almost 10 years. And that too, during the time of the building of the schools and, and the library and so forth. That was very interesting too. And I think probably there again, citizen participation in that. You don't want all architects and builders on the building committee. You want a few alternate viewpoints to kind of keep a balance in that thing. So that was very interesting, and I think it was we were productive. It's a very essential group, and it's important we always have that permanent building committee.
Bob, you are very passionate about development of the town through
Yeah.
your time here, and that's been sort of the theme that's run through your residency in Weston. Was there any impetus that caused major changes, major issues? It seems to me that you said things are about the same as they were back when you were running the town and doing the planning. Was there anything that happened, any bubble of new residents, any overload of the schools that had to be addressed with some rapidity? Anything that really changed the gradual nature of development in the town?
About the only forces really that were a threat to what the town was would, I think, be characterized as commercial. Glendinning wanted to open up. The reason they're on the river as you go down toward Westport is because we would not let them in Weston, because we could see the handwriting on the wall. If they came in, again, you let them in, you cannot keep the next person out. You can't keep the next person out. You are casting the die when you let that change come in. So I think, and I emphasize this through my tenure, that you have, once you break the mold or the rule on this, why you've got to be willing to face what the real consequences will be. The person who proposes it always sugarcoats it and makes it seem very simple and innocuous, but that's not where the fault lies. It's in the true nature of the change, and I think probably my voice was consistent in the town as to the nature of that threat, to be realistic about what you're doing if you go and change the rules.
How controversial was your position at the time? Did you feel like you were bucking a tide that was going in a different way, or was there a lot of support for the kinds of restrictions that you've proposed?
I think the balance of the town supported me. Yes, I think that's why I was reelected. I was a popular candidate because I came close to leading the ticket in the elections, and that was a reflection, I think, of the position that I had about let's say, the status quo. And for many people, the status quo is anathema. If you don't change things, well, you're not progressing. You're not with it. It's sort of like parenting. You got to go into the new parenting system because the old parenting system is passé. Well, I think the old parenting system works pretty well, and so I'm stuck with it. And it was somewhat the same way with the town. The character of the town began to change, though, with around the 80s. And there it began to change in the architecture and the way wealth discovered the town and began to build these very large houses. This was a very big house when we moved here in '57. The house across from Norfield Church, where the Richard Muzzy and his wife lived at one time. I thought that was a huge house. I look at it now, and it's a lot narrower, and the rooms are a lot smaller. Now, I realize it wasn't so big, but for those times, it was very big. Now, a big house is a big house. And there's one right near Mrs. Cater's farm on Norfield that is about 10,000 feet. that one just as you turn into that lane there. It's a huge house. And I remember because that was built during when I was a code enforcement officer. And I rather marveled at the floor area there and wondering, my golly, how do you fill this thing up? What are you going to do with these rooms? But that has changed, and so any number of larger mansions, I won't call them mansions, they were just very, very big houses with all kinds of amenities, media rooms, indoor pools, so forth. That became the theme for new houses in town. And one reason being that if you had the money to buy the land, well, you had the money to build a big house.
There's been a lot of very prominent folks that have moved to Weston with names that we would recognize
Yeah.
in the arts and in literature. Can you mention a few of the folks that would stand out in your memory as being very well known that had spent a good amount of time here and loved living in this town?
Well, when when Hope and I moved here, there were a lot of artists here because at one time it was very strongly an artist colony and locals. That was it. Stony Brook, all of Stony Brook down in the corner of the town toward Route 136, it was an artist colony. And you look at the layout of the land and the type of buildings there, you could see it must have been something that artists designed because it is unusual. But there were a lot of them. Well, there were, what was it? I think Balanchine, Alice de Lamar. I know Euclid Shook. There were a number of illustrators in town. Well, first of all, this house here was bought by Ben Stahl, who was a very well-known artist in the artist world. He was doing, in his later years, he was doing murals and other major works in Catholic churches. And he did huge panels for a church when he moved to Florida. He was well known worldwide for what he did. He's the one who built the studio there that is now occupied by an artist, coincidentally, which pleases me greatly because it was designed every inch of the way as an artist studio with the north light and the big glass up on top and so on, and that's the way it should be used. But there were a number like that. I took lessons from Euclid Shook, who was a pretty well-known illustrator in New York. There were a lot of them from the advertising, because at one time, New York was the advertising center of the world. And so people like that populated the town and were much part of the mainstream of the community. I didn't, what was it, Alice Doherty? There were any number of people who did that. There were a lot of dabblers because they sort of populated Silvermine. And so there were any number of them. And you find probably today there are probably more lawyers in town than there are artists. But in those days, there were artists all over. They weren't necessarily world famous, but they all lived around here because people like Norman Rockwell and, Hardy Gramatke, people like that lived in Westport. And a lot of their confreres lived here because it was sort of a community of artists as well as normal people.
And there are a lot of wonderful towns around us, as we know.
Oh, yes.
On what is now I-95 corridor.
Mm.
So when people made their trek up from the city to find their next or new
Yeah.
home, they had all kinds of choices in those days and today as well. Of
In the
course.
50s, yes.
So-
There was still some land left in Westport. It was higher priced. Weston was attractive because the land here was reasonable by the standards of that time. Reading was too far out, Easton was kind of in the middle. It wasn't any place. It was a no man's land between Route 7 over here and the Housatonic River and that river over there. So Weston was a natural focus. Its road system arterially was a direct shot to the railroad stations and so forth. So we were destined to be a suburban community at that time because so many people worked in New York. It was the focus. Today, it's not nearly as much the focus.
And why would they choose Weston, say, over Wilton or Westport, if they worked in New York? You said there are a lot of people that worked in the city, of course, and they
Yeah.
still do. And they stop here and they say, this is my spot. What do you think made them make that choice?
Well, I think Westport had commercial. It had the post road. I think Wilton had Route 7. And you get the feeling that you're in kind of a commercial town if you go to Wilton. Your first glance, you don't see all the back roads and the little cul-de-sacs where it's just about like Weston. I think the Weston appeared to be a residential community that you could count on. They did not see the idea that tomorrow there was going to be a commercial establishment built next to you. I think there was a strong confidence that Weston was going to stay what it was, and that if they bought here, they would have a residential place to live in through their lifetime.
A real suburban personality.
Yes, yeah, and established. It was not threat because Westport's Post Road used to have residential homes on it. Then, when they began to develop it, their planning commission was appointed, and it was half lawyers, and they began to change the zoning of the Post Road. They go in 200 feet with a strip for commercial. Then they change it to 400 feet. Then it would leap on to 600 feet. This happened from Wilton border to Fairfield border. And that, then the question is, well, how far up and down the various roads is it going to go? Well, Riverside Avenue gradually began to pick up office buildings and so on. I had friends who lived on the river on Riverside Avenue. They would have been right smack in the middle between two large commercial establishments today. People didn't think that would happen in Weston.
In your decades here, you must have also met some real local characters, not only the celebrities and the famous people.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear some of the most unforgettable characters that you've met over the years.
Well, now we're treading on dangerous ground
Good.
because but one I will mention is Charlie Neuenhaus, who came by way of merchant marine and a photographer to being a developer, largely of Ravenwood and Treadwell area. He was a builder, and he's the one who built Church Lane, where he would have loved to make a little community to sort of offset the Weston Center. He didn't quite have the fire to do it because he talked to me a number of times. Well, gee, I wish we could do it. I say, Chuck, go ahead and make your offer. See how it flies. Don't hold back. Maybe the town will accept it because they may want some kind of a little mini center over there. See how it flies. But he never did it. But he was a very thoughtful guy, and he was very generous. And one of the things he gave me before he died was a sailing atlas of the 1850s by Admiral Maury, which is, I think, worth a lot of money. It's in rather poor condition because it's been battered. All of those albums are in bad condition because they were usually on the navigation table of a ship sliding this way and that way as it went through the water. So the back pages of all of them are gone. But he gave me that, for example, as because he wanted to be sure it had a home somewhere. Now I'm charged with the idea of finding a home for it. But I remember John Bross, the building inspector, he had his own firm ideas about buildings and what were necessary and so forth. And he kind of felt that, well, if I don't think it's necessary, you don't have to do it. He was an independent thinker when it came to the building code. Eh, well, I knew a bunch of the people who took care of the roads in town. I remember two characters tended to rent their equipment to the town at a rather high price. And it was interesting. The Democrat on the Board of Selectmen was almost always from Georgetown. And it was a token assignment. And the Democrats would find somebody there who would serve. And he was sort of a go-along vote with the two Republicans who ran the selectman's office and ran the town. Well, the Democrats, as all of this influx came in the 50s and 60s and so on, a parishioner friend of ours ran for the Democratic Party, Dick Voigt, and he was a character in town. And he ran, he was a very dynamic person, great big guy, and he ran for the Democratic office, and even the Democrats didn't want him, but he prevailed anyway. And he became the third selectman. That's what he was called in those days, which is third selectman, second selectman, first selectman. But he began to look at the books, and he noticed that one of these people was renting a chainsaw to the town at $100 a day, and the other one was renting his digger to the town, even though it was parked. It was an old digger, all rusty, and it was parked in a corner wherever he could park the darn thing, and that was being rented to the town. Well, Dick wrote this story, and I'll divert myself. Pat Heifetz, who I admired greatly, she was a ball of fire, and I loved her husband, Paul Heifetz. He was a friend of mine all my life, and he and I talked many times on the whole matter of zoning and politics in general.
And a good artist, too.
Yeah, and Pat had started the Weston Forum. And she did it by dint of her own energy and the fact that she felt this town needed a paper. And it's almost like Pat Gay today. She was it, and she did most of the articles. She was at the meetings all the time. She was a gadfly. And that wasn't bad because, she made a cartoon of me one time. I was sitting there on my throne with a crown on my head because I made some decision she thought was exceedingly autocratic and uncalled for, meaning she disagreed with it. but anyway, she was a lifesaver, and I have such admiration for the hours she put in to that whole thing. Well, anyway, Dick Voigt released the findings he had to the forum, and that is when it hit the fan. And all of a sudden, the two gentlemen involved retired to Florida, and at that point, the selectmen said, what are we going to do? How are we going to run the road system in town? So they appointed me and four other guys to a highway study commission. Well, I wasn't the chairman. They made me chairman, mainly because I was the guy who was willing to put in the time. So I chaired that, and we came up with a highway study report, which I have a copy of, and I think the library has copies of it, which was quite simple, and it just recommended that the town come up with a minimal highway department. Don't staff for everything, such as sweeping the roads and trimming the trees and so on. Do it for the normal summer construction, clearing out the catch basins and so on, and plowing snow in the winter, and subcontract for all the peripheral duties where it required special equipment or special skills. Tree trimming is a specialty, and so on. So that's the way it went through. We set it up. The town adopted that pretty much as the framework of our system. Well, typically, the way all bureaucracies work, the highway department began to branch out and reach into other areas and take on equipment. And you take on the equipment, you take on the personnel. And so now it's a pretty big operation. It's a good operation. I think Joe Lametta runs a good shop there, but that's what happened there to take over from the very rural, good old boy type of town functioning.
Bob, go back a little bit to your own role in this. You were an engineer
Yeah,
at Sikorsky,
yeah.
and then you started spending more and more time in the planning area of town. And did you manage to keep both jobs at the same time? Did you transition from one to the other?
No, it was very convenient because, first of all, I could be reached on telephone from Gert Walker. Gertrude Walker was town clerk for about 25 years. And she was central to the success of my tenure as chairman of P&Z because we met in the town hall in the clerk's room. There was a big table there and we met there. It wasn't nearly so crowded. We didn't have all the equipment, the copy machines, everything else. Gert had a typewriter in the corner and that's about what you needed. But when we had meetings during the evening, she, as town clerk, was able to open the vault, and we had access to all the maps and everything else. It was so much easier. Today, you can't have access to that, and they meet in a different building. So for me, it was very easy. Gert Walker was there during all the meetings as the clerk of the P&Z. Then when I went to work during the day, I might get a call from Gert and say, "Hey, Bob, we got a question here," and I was able to resolve it that way. It worked out very well. It was serendipitous the way it worked out. And without Gert, it would have been much more tough. And she was a lifesaver for me.
And when did you retire?
I retired when I was 65, which was 1986,
And you're how old now?
94. Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of contributions you made to the town over these years. I wanted to follow up something earlier. You've indicated several times now that you yourself were a character, that you yourself were somewhat controversial, and I don't know whether you want to talk about some of those controversies that you were involved in.
Well, I would say it more that I was outspoken. Because I don't feel that my positions were controversial. I thought they were pretty darn reasonable, and I still do. Because if they're not reasonable, I'm not going to hold for them. So I was not in the mainstream often, because very often the mainstream is really the old stream, just plowing ahead and not seeing where it's going.
But what's reasonable to you?
I would guess I'm a born conservative in that I feel that you've got to pay for everything. And that is not only money, but it's duty, it's care, it's all those things. And stemming from that, when I look at, I guess probably the reason I stayed a Republican most of my life is because my Democratic friends would never tell me how you're going to pay for it. And I thought that was kind of a central to the question. Now, Paul Krugman of the New York Times wouldn't worry about that. But it bothered me. And in that sense, I'm a conservative. And I think Hope is a born conservative. She's sort of, Griggs is Scottish and so on. And so she minds a penny. And she's very sensible. And so I think some of that sensibility also rubbed off on me, that there should be a sensibility to everything you do, and don't cloud it or pretend. And so much of politics is pretense or fake argument. And so maybe I didn't go along with it. I think the controversial aspect of it is a consequence, not because I was controversial to start with. I think I was just taking a position that I thought was rational, and somebody else thought I was controversial because I was upsetting the apple cart.
So Bob, if we had a bunch of your friends in this room and we put you in the kitchen so you couldn't hear, what do you think they'd say about your contributions and what they remember that you did that will stay with this town for a long, long time? How would they describe Bob Turner's participation in Weston and what you've done?
Well, if it was Paul Heifetz, he'd say nice things about me. Because he was a Democrat, and he and I saw pretty much eye to eye. And he would say that I stuck to my last week as steady contributor. I think somebody like Nil Skinswald, who is an old-timer in town, would say the same thing. I think Chuck Neuenhaus would say I ran a fair commission. And that's important because other people at times thought I was very dictatorial. And I would say maybe I was, but I was also positive. And I think in many cases on a board, that's important that you let, because not as chairman, but as an arguer for a point, I think it's very important that each member speak up and make their point. And I think in that regard, why there are probably some members of various commissions that would say I did well. I think Tom Aquila might say I did okay, because I've known Tom a long time. I have great respect for him. The way he handled the church, the Hurlbut fire, they only lost 3 days of school.
Tell us about the fire.
Well, Hurlbut Elementary at that time was a 3-story building. And you don't build schools with multiple floors. It wasn't done in those days. I grew up going to a elementary school that was 4 stories high. It worked beautifully. It was efficient use of space, and we didn't all fall downstairs and have traumas and everything else. It worked fine. But when it was a kind of a carryover from the time that people were reasonable about what a school building could be. So it was multiple stories, and it was a great building. For some reason, it caught on fire one time, and it burned to the ground. It was way beyond the ability of the volunteer fire department in town to handle. And of course, Georgetown came down, and I think the other towns responded, but it was a loss. There were probably 10 classes being held in there. There were more than 10 classrooms, but there were 10 classrooms that were home rooms for the kids. And so that was a devastating thing for the school system because here they had no home. They had no equipment, they had nothing. Well, it was quite remarkable. Tom was, he's a very capable person. He managed with a school board. I don't know what the role of the school board was. I'm sure they worked wonders also. I can't name the names, I wish I could. But we got into Temple Israel. Temple Israel opened their nursery school or their primary school doors to us, and immediately some of our classes opened up down there. The only problem was how to get them there. That was a transportation problem. We had some others in. Where did some of the others go, Hope?
They all went to Hurlbut.
No, I mean after Hurlbut burned down. Some went to Temple Israel. They were spread around. But as I recall,
I thought they all went to Hurlbut.
no, Hurlbut's the one that burned down.
I mean, they all went to the temple.
Okay, well maybe they did. I think a couple squeezed into the rest of the buildings. But we only lost, it seems to me, 2.5 to 3 days of school time for those classes because of the abilities of the school to respond. And I give high marks to Tom for that.
what other major events like that were during your time in the town?
Well, I guess another would be the Lamazo gravel pit, which is where Crystal Lake is today. When Hope and I moved into town, there was a big, tall rock crusher sitting on, that's an aquifer on that side of Broad Street, from from Broad Street in Weston all the way down to the Saugatuck River is a beautiful aquifer. It's a huge aquifer. And out of that is drawn probably 2 million gallons a day to feed Bridgeport and Fairfield and so on. That pumping station that you see on the road going down to Western Road going down is the pumping station that provides that through pipes to those other communities there. And the only reason that water's there is because of that aquifer. Well, Lamazo, who was a contractor in the area here, bought the land and started to mine the gravel because at that time the Connecticut Turnpike was being built and they needed all kinds of fill and ballast for the roads. So his rock crusher was going all the time because they needed crushed rock. They didn't want the boulders, they wanted crushed rock. So trucks were going in and out all the time. The rock crusher was running all the time. It ran 7 days a week for a while. And we who lived, Hope and I, who lived on the side of the hill in Weston Road there, just above Weston Gardens today, we heard it all the time. It became quite controversial in town. And later when we had moved to here, but at the time I was still chairman of P&Z, the town instituted a lawsuit with Mr. Lamazo to make him stop the rock crushing operation. I don't know the details of the lawsuit, but what it came down to was that it went to Stamford Superior Court, and the judge said there, well, I don't think you have the authority to stop Mr. Lamazo, but he's willing to work out an agreement with you because he wants to retire. So I was charged by the town as its representative to deal with, Robert, what was his name? It was Chuck Neuenhouse's lawyer. He's still around. He's an old, skinny guy, an impeccable lawyer. I always got along with him because he always was easy to deal with, very straightforward. I wish I could remember his name. It'll come to me and I'll mention it. And John Lamazo, who was a nephew, I think, of the original Lamazo, who is now the heir of the operation. And we worked on that for about a year under the court stipulated agreement. And we came up with a development plan for Crystal Lake that I'm very proud of because it met every requirement of the zoning regs. There was no need to make a concession. The people, when the agreement was first set up, were sure I was going to give away the store. And I could see their apprehension. It was reasonable because it looked like it would be very difficult to deal with these people. Well, it turned out it wasn't. And so we worked out that Crystal Lake agreement. It wasn't Crystal Lake at that time. It was still, I guess it was Lake Lamazo. So I called it then. But we came up with the agreement, and it went to the court, and it went to our own P&Z. I think I stepped aside on that, where it was adopted as the development plan for that whole area there. And it worked out very well, because they were it's a good development. The one flaw, the one thing I overlooked was that in the middle of the lake, the lots reached into the lake up to the 20% allowed for a lot to be water, but it didn't cover the middle of the lake. And somebody about 10 years ago got concerned that somebody's going to come along and raise Cain by claiming that center part of the lake as unclaimed land, even though it was underwater, just mischief and so on. So they all hurried to the law and came up with an agreement. Now it is owned in 1/24 parts by all the people around. So all is serene now. Nobody can sneak in and buy up the center part of Crystal Lake for their own purposes. Maybe they build something on stilts. But
So we've got the fire, and we've got Crystal Lake. What other major events, either in terms of building and development or even natural disasters, were there during your time here?
well, I had we as a P&Z. I don't like to characterize it as myself because I was really P&Z at those times. We're always fighting certain developers who wanted to, and I just don't want to mention names because there's still legal contention on some of these. They had to be dealt with I think what is just due respect for the law. There's a strong tendency on the part of town boards throughout any jurisdiction, any country, place in the country, to be a bit autocratic and dogmatic because they have the power and they tend to overlook the reach of the law or the, let's say, how much of the law is on the side of the applicant. And so the following the prudent course and the legal course sometimes is not a natural thing for boards to do. So I several times was under considerable pressure to go this way when I think a case in point was Ruth Lockwood, who we had some strong-minded people on the P&Z at that time, and she and her brother Gene owned all that parcel of land that is September Lane, October Drive, and November Trail. It's a lot of acres, and it was the Lockwood farm at one time. And her brother went up to upstate somewhere to do his work, and she came in to see us about developing her land there. And she's in your list of people that you interviewed. Little lady, all hunched over, and she presented her case, and these two people didn't want to deal with her because they felt she should get an attorney, and she should have the engineers all lined up, that they should make a package presentation, because this was a significant part of the town of Weston, right in the middle, and we want to be sure it's done right. And that's where I disagreed with these gentlemen and took the position that nobody had to have a lawyer to present an application to P&Z, that if the need for a lawyer came up, it would be apparent. And so we went with that, and Ruth, bless her heart, very soft-spoken little lady, meek and so on, but also quite purposeful. She did it all herself, that little peanut. And so it worked out fine. And I don't recall that we had any lawyers really involved in it at all. Because if we needed a soil scientist or a land development expert, she would get one. And it was done. And it worked fine. So that was another way. I think another case was we needed a town engineer. So I and the chairman of the Board of Finance were appointed to see about hiring a town engineer for the town. And that was Vic Reynolds. Remember, he was a very strong-minded person, also a very good businessman. But he wanted to get a person who was fitting for a town like Weston, which was a pretty high prestige type of town. And we wanted a good engineer, and he had in mind somebody who would probably be pretty much expert in anything. It puzzled me who that person would be. And he was visually at that time maybe pay him something like $60,000, $70,000 a year. And I thought it'd be more prudent to have somebody who could just deal with the local problems at their local level. So in the course of our interviewing people, we ran across this man, Ray Cartelli, who was a retired Corps of Engineers engineer who'd done a lot of things in this country. And he was retired. He was on his own Army pension. So he was willing to come cheap. So I prevailed upon the town to hire this guy. And he came in, I think, at about 18,500. And he was our engineer for, as I recall, about 22 years. And when he retired, I think he was making 21,000. He was a bargain. And he was also a good engineer, because when the floods took out the Godfrey Bridge, he came in and said, "This is beyond my expertise. You want to get a bridge engineer to look at this." So we went out and hired engineers. And when it came to things like cell towers, he said, hire people who are experts there. And it worked out beautifully, just the way it should be. It's sort of like the highway department. Keep the core competencies at home. And then when you have a need for a competency beyond your reach, go out and hire it. And then you only hire it for when you need it, and it goes away. You don't want to put it on your permanent payroll.
The town is again talking about development and planning, and tell us a little bit about your role in developing the first town plan of development, because you were the pioneer in that, and how did that come about and how was it executed?
It came about, I think, because of a statutory requirement. And it had to be, the town had to come up with a town plan, so we did it. And the big question was, some people felt the town was completely inequitable in offering services to the world at large, that we should have public housing, that we should have all kinds of things, and that people shouldn't have to drive so far to get a loaf of bread. There was much feeling like that. And all of this reflected back at how the town was going to present in its town plan arguments that might reject the idea that we want to revise our regulations for that. So we had to be careful in our wording. We had to present a good case, and we did. And it was a rational case. It was based upon the logic of the way the town is set up. That has been pretty much followed and reiterated in each of the successive town plans. The way I see the one today, I just say this is the same record going around again. There are people who say, "Oh, we need this. Oh, we've got to bring in that." And I say, unless conditions have changed, go ahead, look into it. And I think your reasoning, as you find out the facts, will lead you to the conclusion that it doesn't make much sense. So it doesn't bother me too much that these ideas are presented. As a matter of fact, I think they should be reviewed with each iteration of the town plan to make sure that we are staying current with current social needs of a Connecticut small town. But I think we should also keep in mind that these people aren't inventing anything. They're not having any ideas that the people didn't have back in the 50s. I have great respect. The more I read of history, a lot of the history of the 1800s in this country, as to how many intelligent people there were in those days. All the intelligence didn't suddenly accrue with the advent of, I don't know, Harvard and Yale coming to Western. And that, so if you follow the facts, you'll probably come up with an iteration of the town plan that will be remarkably similar to the ones we've put out in the past. I wouldn't expect big changes, but those people are going to have to follow through on it and see where it leads them. The forum has this concern about the town of Weston isn't growing. I don't know of any reason why it should grow. I don't know what the imperative is. Is there some imperative that says Weston should be 20,000 people in 10 years and 30,000 in another? What is the force behind it? It doesn't make sense. Unless you want to completely change Weston and bring in a new type of town. So that, again, I think that will take care of itself. Sure, Weston's slow on sales. It's an expensive town. And it takes a lot of money. And if the hedge fund people are all under the gun with the government and the IRS and so forth, well, maybe they don't have all these billions to come into town and and build a big house or buy a lot and clear cut it. So
When you were active on the various boards, do you recall any period in your career working with the town where there was a fiscal problem, having trouble paying our bills, or was that never an issue in Weston as you were moving things ahead?
we had a chairman of the Board of Finance at one time that was sure he didn't want to approve any town budget where we didn't go back to reality. And he said, land prices in town are too high. And until we cannot raise the taxes to meet all these requirements, we've got to reduce expenses. And I will not approve this budget until the price of land in town goes back to reasonable levels, meaning 1930 levels. Well, it's never going to go back. And land prices around the world are all going up because the population of the world's exploding. So he would have said, no, we can't afford it. We don't have enough money. This is asking too much. But I don't think the town has ever been in a position of lacking funds or going broke. I think it's been a very stable financial town, and because it's got a good financial base, and it's really more a matter of where you're going to allocate the money. It's no different than Congress. You just be sure you got the money, just be sure you spend it wisely.
I'd like to go back to the question that Neil raised earlier about people sitting in this room talking
Yeah.
about you while you're in the kitchen. And you talked about one dimension of it, but I'd like to talk about another one, which is you're known as a man of character. You have a strong character, internal character. And, what would people say about that? I think one of the things could be that you have the personality, in your view, to deal with people, and that you feel that it's important to be nice to people. We could talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think when I'm an optimist, I think I was given very good background training by my mother, which was a staunch Christian lady, very quiet about it, but very Christian, and my father. I was adopted, and so both my parents are adopted parents, but they were my parents, and they were both staunch Christian people. They gave me very strong moral background to compare against, so that I always knew if I was shading the question. I think also that the people I knew were very much the same way, and I think hope is a balance wheel to anybody about what's proper in this world. So you might
Bob
say,
was adopted before his mother was married.
Yeah.
he was adopted as she was a single parent.
The woman who adopted me was a Vassar graduate in 1918 who went out to Wyoming because she loved horses and wanted adventure. While she was in Wyoming on a trail ride with another woman, she ran out of money. So she called up the Bishop of Wyoming, who happened to be a friend of her father's, and said, I need a job to make some money. And he said, well, we've got an orphanage down in Laramie that is crowded, and we could use some help. So she went down to the orphanage in Laramie for a while. And it was while she was there, because of the crowding, I of five, family of five. I had one brother who died, three sisters who went with me to the orphanage. I was one who got moved into the room with her. And you know how bonding takes place between people. You get a small child, you can't not just break that bond. So when it came time for Mom to come back to the East to get married and lead the normal Eastern establishment life, she said, I'm not coming back without this little boy. And she wouldn't come back. So she finally managed with the Bishop of Wyoming to make arrangements for her to adopt me as a single woman. It was a very courageous act.
Did she bring you back with that cowboy hat, Bob? Is that how that?
No,
Yeah.
I was 14. I was 14 when I got my first
Can
Stetson.
you expand on that? When I moved to Weston, a good friend
Yeah.
of mine said, you've got to meet some important people in town. And one of them is this gentleman named Bob Turner. And I said, who is he? And he said, you'll recognize him. He's the man with the hat. So I'd love to hear the story.
Well, I think it really started as I got older. I realized I didn't want the sun beating on my head all the time. I wasn't a beach bum any longer. We're trying to collect a good tan. And also, as I wore glasses more and more outside, it kept the rain off my glasses. I liked the fact that it kept my head warm in the winter too. So it was just that I wore that hat probably for the same reason that they wear them out west. So I would say you go out west, ask somebody why he's wearing the hat. You'll probably get the same answer that I give you.
Tell us a little bit about your family life. When did you meet Hope? And obviously she's very important in your life. And tell us a little bit about that history.
I met Hope first because my mother, my adopted mother, knew this family in Irvington, New York. And she took me to their house to meet Mom's friend. And at that time, Hope and her sister and her brother were there. I was about 12 and she was 6. And so I didn't pay any attention. You know, 12-year-old boy doesn't look at 6-year-old girl. But that's when I first met her. But then what goes around, comes around. So later on, as I got out of left the Army in the World War II and came home to Irvington, we started to play baseball in a field there every Sunday. And so Hope would come to that. And one thing led to another. I would take her to New York at the end because she worked in New York and I worked in New Jersey. So it was just one of those romances that sort of crept up on you. And so we got married in 52. And so I'd known her a long time. And my adopted mother had known that family for a long time. Because
She and my aunt were best friends.
yeah. And so that goes way back. So that's, we grew up in the same town, and our family stayed in the same town. The last member of my family just died, my brother. He died last summer. He lived in the same town. We'd grown up in Irvington, which was very much like this town. It hasn't grown. It grew out to its limits, and now it's that way. And you can't go piling more people in there without destroying it. So Irvington has stayed that way for a long time, and that was the origin of a lot of our thinking of an orderly, stable community.
Bob had 3 brothers by the married family.
Yeah.
His mother
Yeah.
married after she brought him home.
From a explaining point of view, we always have trouble with the family tree because I have my 3 sisters and I have my 3 brothers. These are my natural sisters and these are my adopted brothers, but they're all part of the family. And they in turn have their own tentacles that reach out. So our family has many angles to it, and it's very difficult to explain.
So what year did you get married, and then you had 3 children?
52. Then we had the first 53, 54, and 56. We had the 3 kids. And they all lived nearby. Easton, Trumbull, and Armont. And it's the way to do it, because that way, as grandparents, we get to see our grandchildren.
It's so nice. That's part of your stability in your family long term, is that people seem to keep gathering around. Now, I think we're going to wind this up for today, but what question didn't we ask that we should be asking about Bob Turner?
I don't know of any. I'm thinking now, the Memorial Day parade's coming up, and I'll be marching in it. I think Nils Gindwall will be marching next to me. He's Navy. And I'm trying to think of who else might be in town from that era. There are Korea and Vietnam, and of course Afghanistan and the Iraq War. There are a lot of those. But I think we're winding down. Not many of us left. So I kind of look at that, and it gives me a reference point. It makes me realize how old I am. That I'm of another generation and another time, but I've been able to successfully traverse into this generation and be accepted here.
And Arne's right. We've taken a lot of your time, and this has been fascinating. And I'm just overwhelmed with the stories. I did want to ask you one last question, and we'll see where it fits. You attended Cornell.
Yeah.
And you were, in effect, left Cornell during the war, in World War II.
Yeah.
And tell me what you did. I understand that you had an interesting assignment after you...
Well, I never got in combat, but I think it's because I tended to get good grades in school. And when I went into the service, General Hap Arnold had talked the Selective Service Commission into diverting all the raw recruits that came in to the Air Force if they scored higher than 110 on the GCT test. That's the General Classification Test. Well, I had spent 2 years in the ROTC Field Artillery. I'd been to Camp Drum, or Pine Camp at that time, and we'd fired guns, and we had ridden around in the 6x6s and all the rest of it, doing our various things. So when I went into the service, I enlisted in 42. I left Cornell and enlisted. I expected to go either to Camp Fort Bragg in Alabama or Georgia, wherever it is, or Fort Sill in Oklahoma, because those were the training grounds for the armored divisions. I got on a troop train out of Camp Upton in Long Island, and we started to wander around through the Pennsylvania hills and so on. Well, I have a very good sense of direction, and largely because I did a lot of navigating on my own as a boy, and I learned it from my peers and so forth and so on. So as we were going down, I said, okay, we've gone too far west for Fort Sill. for Fort Bragg. We're going to Fort Sill. We started down the Mississippi River, and we kept going and going. And I said, hey, we're going past where you turn for Fort Sill. Where the heck are we going? We ended up in Biloxi, Mississippi, at Keijzer Air Force Base, and it had just been filled-in swamp. It was nothing but tents and boards to walk on, because it was a swamp. And that's when I first found out that I was in the Army Air Corps. And so I went to radio gunnery school. My eyes weren't good enough, so I couldn't fly. I got an appointment to go to Annapolis as a boy. My father used his influence to get an appointment, but I couldn't see well enough. In those days, you had to have 20/20, or you didn't get into any of the academies. So I went into a radio operator gunner school in Sioux Falls in the winter, freezing cold. It's like Minnesota. And I came in about second of a class 800. So they meant I was noticed. So they sent me to communication school. And I scored there well, so I was noticed. So they sent me to radar school, because radar was the big thing then. It was very developmental. There was no radar. You couldn't go out and get a radar set. They were all experimental, made by MIT and Bell Labs and so on. So I ended up in a radar development unit that was trying to figure out how you can use radar in bombing missions. So I ended up at Langley Field flying in a B-17 that was radar equipped, and we always got the latest. And we would fly out in we'd fan out from Langley all over the country, taking pictures and so forth, and coming back and analyzing them and seeing what you could do with this and what you could do with that to make a simulated bombing run. It was very interesting information, and I think that's why I ended up there, just because I was able to keep up with the technology and so forth, and I was probably in a good spot. I probably did as much as a member of the armed forces as I could have there. I don't know whether I don't think it made a good infantryman at all. I was too scared.
Well, Bob, thank you so much. And it's been very educational, it's been fun, and intriguing. So
Well,
thank you.
I've enjoyed it. I'm glad you guys came. And I'm glad the words will get carried on. That's the main thing.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot about this town. And I think there's another generation that will enjoy reading all this stuff. And drawings benefit from it.
Yes.
That's what we're going to try to do. This is perpetuity in
Yep.
its best form.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well,
thank
I'm for perpetuity.
I'll drink to that.
you. Yes, we'll all drink to perpetuity.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.